Chapter 1. A knock at breakfast. The morning sun poured through the windows of Hercule Poirot's modest flat on Fairway Street, casting warm patterns across the breakfast table where Poirot and I, Captain Hastings, sat in companionable ease. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the buttery scent of croissants, creating an air of simple contentment. Poirot, impeccable in his dark suit and meticulously waxed mustache, buttered his toast with fastidious care. I, meanwhile, skimmed the morning paper, muttering at the headlines. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot murmured, reaching for the strawberry preserve with a delicate hand. "How agreeable are life's simple pleasures, well-set table, a good friend, and no urgent matters to disturb the digestion." I chuckled. "Enjoy it while it lasts, old chap. Peace never lingers long with you." As if on cue, a sharp knock shattered the calm. Before I could rise, the door swung open, revealing Mrs. Grange, our stout, no-nonsense landlady, her apron dusted with traces of her morning's work. She fixed Poirot with a stern gaze. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, arms akimbo, "your rent for this month remains unpaid." Poirot stood, bowing slightly with that charm that had softened fiercer hearts than Mrs. Grange's. "Madame, 1,000 apologies, mere oversight. Next month I shall pay for 2 months together. Voila, all will be set right." Mrs. Grange, though skeptical of such promises, could not resist his courtesy. With a nod and a slight sniff, she retreated, the door closing firmly behind her. Poirot returned to his seat, a twinkle in his eye. "Mon ami," he said, smoothing his napkin across his lap. We made breakfast in peace. We had scarcely resumed when a second knock, sharp and insistent, sounded. I sighed. There goes our peace. I stepped into the hall and returned moments later with a single envelope. Poirot looked up, curious. "Who was it?" "A postman," I replied, handing him the letter. "He left this." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, that can mean only one thing a case, perhaps." With a silver fruit knife, he slit the envelope open, his movements precise. As he scanned the contents, his demeanor sharpened, his attention wholly absorbed. The letter, stamped with the local police department's insignia, was brief but urgent. Mr. Edward Worthington, a renowned jeweler, had been found dead at his residence under suspicious circumstances. Whether suicide or something more sinister, the truth remained veiled. The police requested Paris' immediate assistance, setting the letter carefully aside. Poirot dabbed his mouth with his napkin as breakfast, quite forgotten, it appears. "Hastings," he said quietly, "the tour morning is to take a rather more serious turn. Trouble, Hastings." Folding his newspaper pool, not at grave trouble. "Mon ami, Mr. Edward Worthington, you call him the jeweler of considerable fames, and his death the circumstances are not clear, I say." Stinks exclaimed. "You don't suspect foul play?" That, Poirot said, rising to his feet with sudden decision, is precisely what we must determine. He moved towards the small writing desk by the window and retrieved his traveling case. A modest but efficient affair's movements were deliberate, betraying none of the haste that Hastings often displayed when excitement stirred him. "Wilt you'd be so good as to assist me in packing, Hastings?" Shifting uncomfortably, "I'm afraid I can't accompany you today, old fellow. It's my daughter's birthday, a family gathering, and all that you understand." Poirot paused, his eyes softening. "But of course, mon ami, family is important. Most important. I shall manage alone." In truth, Poirot felt a slight pang. Hastings's company was always a comfort, but he had faced far worse without assistance. He busied himself assembling the essentials: a fresh pair of gloves, his silver-topped cane, a small notebook, and a selection of fine pencils, tools he deemed necessary in the pursuit of truth. "You'll be all right?" Hastings asked, a hint of guilt in his voice. Poirot smiled. But naturally, I am, as you say, an old hand at these matters outside the sounds of the city. We're beginning to stir the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the distant murmur of market traders setting up their stalls. Pooh placed the letter carefully in his breast pocket, adjusted his hat with precision, and made for the door. At the threshold, he paused and turned it back briefly. Enjoy the birthday, Hastings. Give my felicitations to the young lady. I shall. Hastings promised, watching Poirot disappear down the narrow staircase. With his usual, almost military briskness, left alone, Hastings shook his head with a smile. I don't envy whoever's responsible for this, he muttered to himself. They won't have a prayer once Poirot gets started. Meanwhile, on the bustling streets below, Hercule hailed a cab with an upraised hand, stepping neatly into the vehicle. Brentford Street, number 37. I instructed the driver crisply as the cab pulled away. Poirot leaned back against the worn leather seat, his fingertips pressed lightly together. His mind was already whirring, tracing the possibilities. Mr. Edward Worthington, a man of impeccable reputation, but recent financial troubles. A death in such a household was seldom straightforward suicide. Perhaps yet, Poirot's instincts, honed over countless investigations, prickled with a familiar unease. There were always little things with the things Tars missed that spoke volumes to Poirot, and he intended to find them as the cab rattled over the cobbled streets towards the quiet, affluent neighborhood where Edward Worthington had lived. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, letting his little gray cells do their silent, methodical work. Whatever awaited him at number 37, Brentford Street. Hercule Poirot would be ready. Chapter. To the locked room. The black cab pulled up outside an elegant, slightly weary townhouse on Brentford Street. Hercule Poirot alighted, packed Casey, driver, with a crisp note, and gazed up at the gray stone facade. Heavy curtains were drawn across the windows, and a distinct air of melancholy clung to the building like mist. He ascended steps briskly. A uniformed constable stationed at the door admitted him with a respectful nod, and within moments Poirot was ushered into the house. Inside, his atmosphere was heavy with sorrow and unease. Poirot's sharp eyes said nothing. The whisper of servants in the hallway, the strained expression on the butler's face, the faint odor of gunpowder lingering in the air. Inspector Arthur awaited him on their first floor, standing just outside an oak-paneled door. He was a broad-shouldered inman, his middle years, with a practical manner and honest, straightforward eyes, greeted Poirot warmly, extending a hand. Welcome, Supro. I'm glad you could come so quickly. Poirot inclined his head. It is always the pleasure to assist Inspector, especially when it concerns matters as serious as this. Arthur gestured towards the door. Come in. I should like you to have a look for yourself. Poirot entered the room at the center of airily furnished study. Mr. Edward Worthington's body lay sprawled on a Persian rug. A considerable pool of blood had formed beneath him, staining the elaborate weave. His right hand still clutched a revolver, and his lifeless stared up at the ornate plaster ceiling. Poirot advanced slowly, his gaze moving methodically over every detail: the overturned chair near the desk, the scattered papers, the faint scorch mark on the sleeve of Edward's dressing gown. A thing escaped his notice. Arthur joined him, speaking quietly. As a sad business. Edward was a respected man. Poirot nodded, absently crouching down a little to examine the revolver without touching it. His nostrils flared delicately, detecting the acrid scent of burnt powder. Arthur cleared his throat with, Do you think, Mr. Poirot, murder or suicide? Poirot, still observing the scene, replied with careful deliberation. At this moment, Inspector, I cannot say. You must not rush to conclusions without conducting a full investigation. Earth gave a slight, understanding smile. Fair enough. What? You like to hear my view? Straight and smoothing an invisible crease from his sleeve, but, of course, I value your opinion. Inspector Arthur folded his arms. It seems to me a straightforward suicide. Mr. Edward had been under tremendous financial strain. From what we've gathered, he recently suffered devastating losses in his business friends report that he had become despondent. Pooh inclined his head, encouraging him to continue. Arthur gestured towards the heavy oak door, and there is the matter of. The room itself was locked from the inside. There is only one door, and no other means of entry or exit the window. I latched firmly, and the key was found in Mr. Edward's own pocket. Piece is glinted. Briefly, the key, an important detail indeed. Arthur agreed the simplest explanation is that he locked himself in and well ended his own life. Pooh, wassailing for a moment, absorbing every word, weighing every nuance. Then, in his soft voice, he asked, "Is there no duplicate key to the room?" Arthur hesitated. "There is a second key." "Yes, it's in the possession of Mr. Edward's wife, Florence." "Very good." Poirot said it. "It's important to be thorough, and tell me, Inspector Wood, what exactly was recovered from the scene?" Arthur consulted his notebook. Only 2 items of significance. First, the key found in Redward's pocket. Second, the revolver, still clutched in his hand. Poirot stepped closer to the body once more, his gaze narrowing. He took careful note of the position of Edward's arm, the angle at which the revolver laid the pattern of blood on the root. These were the small things, the overlooked details that often spoke volumes to Hercule. He moved around the room, observing the heavy velvet curtains, the glass cabinet displaying Edward's collection of antique watches, the fireplace cold and empty. Everything was neat, orderly, almost too orderly. To others, it might have seemed any open and shut case, but to her Pooh, the slight mausolectum, the tiniest irregularity, was enough to hint that the truth, thorough truth, was still hidden in the shadows. Chapter 3. A Careful Eye. For a few moments the room was silent, broken only by the muted ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then Poirot turned to Inspector Arthur, his expression grave. "This," Poirot said firmly, "is not a suicide, it is murder." Arthur's brows lifted in surprise, but he remained silent, waiting for Poirot to explain. Poirot stepped closer to Thibaut. Once more, his hands neatly clasped behind his back. "The bullet," he continued, "struck Edward in the chest." "Now, Monger Inspector, it is a curious thing. When Eamon takes his own life with a firearm, he very rarely chooses to shoot himself in the chest. The instinct, the natural inclination, is to fire at the head." Arthur frowned thoughtfully. "I see what you mean." But in a moment of desperation, Poirot shook his head gently. "There is more. The bullet was fired from a distance. Had Edward shot himself, there would be gunpowder residue upon his hands. A fine sprinkling, most distinctive vit. I observe no such trace. His hands are quite clean, bent over the corpse, with meticulous care, his gaze lingering on the slender, lifeless fingers. No burns, no blackening of the skin." Poirot murmured, "No powder marks." "The revolver was not fired by this hand." Arthur shifted uneasily, glancing down at the body. "It's a serious accusation." Poirot straightened, smoothing his waistcoat with a flick of his fingertips. "Not an accusation." Inspector an observation always observed the little details. They are what lead to the truth. Stepped back, surveying the scene as a whole. The room itself was orderly, almost dull. Much so, nothing appeared to have been disturbed, save for the overturned chair near the desk. A clumsy touch, perhaps meant to suggest a sudden, emotional outburst. Poirot turned to Arthur once more. "Tell me, if you please. May I examine the key found in Mr. Edward's pocket?" Arthur, though visibly unsettled, nodded. He retrieved a small evidence bag from his jacket and carefully handed it to Poirot. Poirot took the key delicately between his fingers, examining it with the air of a jeweler inspecting a rare gem, headed it over thoughtfully, studying the minute scratches along the shaft, the worn edges of the teeth without. A word slipped a magnifying lens from his pocket and bent over the body, again beginning a gene. Slow and painstaking inspection, he examined the folds of Edward's dressing gown, the positioning of the arms, the direction of the bloodstains. Most notably, he observed the placement of the body lying directly opposite the door, as though Edward had been facing it when he was shot. Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. The body that is too precisely positioned had a man in the depths of despair wished to end his life. He would have collapsed in a more natural, uncontrolled manner. Here, the arrangement. It suggests calculation. Arthur moved closer, lowering his voice instinctively. You think someone staged the scene? Poirot gave a small, satisfied nod. So, Inspector, this was a carefully planned murder. The criminal has been clever, very clever, but even the cleverest criminal leaves behind the smallest of clues. Held the key up once more, turning it in the light. And this key, it may yet tell us more. Its presence in the pocket is too convenient. Arthur exhaled, heavily running a hand through his hair. I must admit, Poirot, I hadn't thought to question it. A locked room, a man with troubles, a weapon in his hand. It seemed so clear. Poirot smiled gently, a twinkle of sympathy in his eye. It is easy to accept the obvious, my friend, but it is the task of the detective to see not what is, but what is hidden. There was a soft knock at the door. A young constable stepped inside, saluting smartly. Sir, the arrangements have been made. The body is ready to be transported for post-mortem. Nodded briskly. Very good. See to it at once. The constable withdrew, and within minutes, 2 plainclothes officers entered with a stretcher. Poirot stood silently observing with respectful gravity as Edward Worthington's body was carefully lifted and carried from the room. When the last echo of footsteps had faded down the staircase, Poirot turned to Arthur. Once more, the post-mortem will reveal much, he said softly, but already we know enough to be certain. This was no act of despair, it was an act of deliberate malice, calculated and executed with remarkably cunning. Arthur looked at Poirot, a troubled frown knitting his brow. The killer, Poirot. Poirot smiled thinly. The killer, Inspector, is here somewhere. Close by. We must proceed with method, with order, and with caution. For Wolver committed this crime. They possess both nerve and intelligence. Replaced the magnifying lens carefully into his pocket. His mind already racing ahead. The stage was set. The players were gathering, and the first move in a deadly game had been made. Chapter 4. A Widow's Account. Keel remained for a moment longer in the dim, heavy stillness of the study, letting his thoughts settle into their usual, precise order. Then, with a final glance at the now empty room, he turned to Inspector Arthur. Tell me, Inspector, he said quietly, who exactly resides in this house? Arthur, still flipping through his notebook, answered without hesitation. Mr. Edward lived here with his wife, Florence Worthington, their young son, Harper, and their maid. Lily. Poole inclined his head thoughtfully. Mercy, it is important always to know who is within the walls. With that, Poirot stepped into the hallway where Florence Worthington stood near the foot of the staircase. She was a slight, elegant woman, her dark hair drawn neatly back, though the strain of the morning was evident in the pallor of her cheeks and the trembling of her hands. She clutched a lace handkerchief tightly, as if it were her only anchor. Poirot approached with the utmost delicious voice. Soft, madame, he said, gently bowing. Slightly, forgive me, but there are a few questions I must ask. I know this is a difficult time. Florence nodded, numbly dapping at the corners of her red-rimmed eyes. Firstly, Poirot, said Heaston, kind but firm, may I ask, do you suspect anyone of having committed this crime? Florence shook her head slowly. Her voice, when it came, was no more than a whisper. "No, Miss Buffo, I cannot think of anyone who would wish Edward harm. He was a good man." Poirot inclined his head sympathetically, though inwardly he remained cautious. Often grief clouded judgment, and sometimes it concealed inconvenient truths. "And may I inquire, Poirot," continued Poirot, "where at the time your husband died?" Florence managed to steady her voice. Was attending a party at my friend Dorothy's house in the neighboring village. Had just bought a new house. There was a gathering of close friends to celebrate. Pooh gave a small, encouraging tap. "What time did you leave this house, madame?" "Around 7 o'clock. Florence replied. Edward had said he did not feel well and preferred to stay at home. Poirot made a brief note in his little leather-bound book, his pencil scratching softly across the page. "And you remained at the party for how long?" "I stayed quite late," Florence said, her eyes downcast. "It was after midnight when I returned." Todd was a brief pause as she struggled to compose herself. Poirot waited patiently, understanding that a heavy truth often emerged only when one allowed its space. "I learned of Edward's death only when I came back," she continued. "Lily, our maid, met me at the door," she said. Edward had not answered when she knocked. She was worried, but she hadn't dared to disturb him earlier. Florence's hands twisted the handkerchief. "Shusley, use the spare key I carry," she said, and when I opened the door, she broke off, her breath catching painfully. Poirot's voice was low and steady. "Take your time, madam." Florence pressed the handkerchief to her mouth before continuing in a broken whisper. "I found him lying there on the floor. There was so much blood, and their revolver was still in his hand." Her voice dissolved into sobs. Pooh, his face grave made no move to interrupt. He simply stood by, allowing her the dignity of her grief in his long experience. He knew that emotion once spent often left a clearer mind behind. When Florence had regained a measure of composure, Poirot asked one last question. "This spare key, madame, it has always been in your possession?" She nodded miserably. "Yes, Edward kept one key. I had the other." Pooh made another discreet note, his mind already sifting through the implications. "Thank you, madam," he said with quiet sincerity. "You have been most helpful. I shall not trouble you further just now." Florence gave a trembling nod, then turned and made her way upstairs, her movement slow and uncertain. Poirot watched her go, his keen eyes thoughtful. Grief, yes, real, enough fear. There had been in her account a carefulness, the precision of detail, dainted that he found curious. Grieved. Women often spoke chaotically with confusion, but Florence's story had been very clean, very precise. It was not necessarily suspicious, Poirot reminded himself, but it was some method, and Hercule Poirot never ignored something. Inspector Arthur reappeared in the hall, his face troubled. "Well, what do you think of her?" Poirot merely smiled faintly, tapping his closed notebook against his hand. "I think, monsieur, that madame tells the truth, or at least a version of it." Arthur frowned. "You mean she's lying?" Poirot lifted one elegant shoulder in a small shrug. "Not lying perhaps, but telling only as much as she wishes to tell." In that Inspector Isleways of interest, he glanced around the house once more. "There are other interviews to conduct. Mr. Pa, the maid, the young Sutton, all those who might have seen or heard something." Arthur nodded grimly. "I'll have them sent in." Poirot tucked his notebook away with a soft, decisive motion. "The smallest detail, Inspector, it is often the key to the whole mystery." And with that, Hercule Poirot prepared to peel back the next layer of the Worthington household secrets. Chapter 5. Quiet Suspicions. Having spoken to Florence, Poirot knew key. There were still other voices to hear. In the house, other versions of the truth, to be weighed and measured with the greatest care. He motioned to Inspector Arthur, who stood at a respectful distance. "I should like to speak with the son next, Poirot," said young Harper Worthing. Within a few minutes, Harper was brought before him, a boy or perhaps 17, with tousled hair, a casual slouch, and an expression that suggested found the proceedings mildly irritating rather than tragic. Poirot, always a master of reading the human face, noted this at one chair, gestured for Harper to sit on a low chair opposite him. You comfortable? Mongrel good. Now tell me, where were you at the time your father died? Harper shrugged with teenage indifference. I was in my room, he said, listening to music. Poole tilted his head. Musicien, Harper confirmed. It was pretty loud. I didn't hear anything, not until Lily came, knocking, and told me something was wrong. And then Harper leaned back in the chair, swinging one leg idly. I went to Dad's room, tried to open the door, but it was locked. I couldn't get it open, no matter what I did. Poole made a careful note in his little book, his pencil scratching faintly. He observed Harper keenly, the casual posture, the dispassionate voice, the absence of grief. When Harper lapsed into silence, Poirot fixed him with a penetrating gaze. You seem very calm, mon ami, he said softly. Your father has just died in violent and tragic circumstances, and yet you do not seem troubled. Harper met Poirot's eyes without flinching. No, he said bluntly. I'm not upset. Poirot raised an eyebrow, inviting further explanation. Harper obliged his mouth, twisting slightly. My father was always on my case, always shouting at me to turn music down, to study harder, to grow up and be serious. He made air quotes mockingly. We didn't exactly get along. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. For a long moment still, he said at last, death has a way of softening the heart. Does it not? Harper gave a careless shrug. Not mine, Poirot Medina. Discreet note. Then gave a small, courteous cue. Mel Messy, young Missy, that will ball. For now. Harper rose and sauntered away without a backward glance. Poirot closed his notebook carefully and turned to Inspector Arthur. You see, mon ami, he murmured, it is not always the tears that tell the truth sometimes. It is the absence of tears that speaks more loudly. Arthur grunted. Unconvinced, just a selfish young pup, nothing more. Poirot smiled thinly, but said nothing. There remained one more interview to conduct. He straightened his scuffs with meticulous care. Now I should like to speak with the maid Lily. Arthur gave the necessary orders, and presently Lily was ushered into the hallway. She was a slight girl, perhaps in her early 20s, with fair hair tucked neatly under a starched cap and nervous hands that fidgeted with the edge of her apron. Poirot greeted her with a reassuring smile. Do not be afraid, mademoiselle, he said gently. Just tell me what you saw. Ian heard. Lily nodded, swallowing hard now. Poirot continued. Where were you when the murder occurred? I had gone to take Mr. Edward his tea, Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was just after 7. You knocked on the door. Yes, sir, several times. I called out too, but there was no answer. And what did you do then? I went to find master, Harper. Lily explained. I told him that Mr. Edward wasn't answering. He came straight away and tried the door himself. Poole leaned forward slightly, his eyes intent, and the door remained locked. Yes, sir, Lily confirmed. We both tried, buted. Wouldn't budge. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, and after that, Mrs. Worthington Merce Florence returned. She used her key to open the door, and then Lily's voice trembled slightly. We saw Mr. Edward lying there on the floor, the revolver was still in his hand. Poirot watched her closely as she spoke, noting the tremor in her voice, the genuine distress in her eyes. Unlike Harper, Lily's reaction seemed instinctively honest. He allowed a moment to pass before asking, Did you notice anything unusual, mademoiselle? Anything at all? Lily hesitated, glancing uncertainly at Inspector Arthur as though seeking permission to speak. Freely, Poirot gave her a small, encouraging, but after a moment's struggle, Lily only shook her head. No, sir, nothing. Who accepted this without protest? He had long learned that some witnesses required Time to remember, or courage, to speak. He regarded her silently for a moment longer, then said, Mademoiselle, you have been most helpful. Lily gave a small, jerky curtsy and hurried away, clearly eager to escape the weight of the conversation. Pooh turned to Inspector Arthur with a faint smile, and so mon ami. He said the picture becomes a little clearer, and yet also a little more clouded. Arthur frowned. How so? Poirot twirled the end of his mustache thoughtfully, because each person tells a story that seems plausible, yet none of their accounts quite fits together as it should. Arthur grunted skeptically. Sounds like you're seeing problems. Sure, there are none. Poirot gave a soft chuckle. Ah, but that is precisely where murder often hides, in the smallest misalignments. He cast a glance back down the hallway where Florence, Harper, and Lily each lingered in different corners of the house. 3 people, 3 stories, none quite overlapping as neatly as they ought. Poirot adjusted his hat with a brisk motion. It is time, Inspector Todd. Look not only at what has been said, but also at what has not been said. With that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the pale afternoon light, the wheels of his brilliant mind turning ever faster. Chapter 6. Shadows of Doubt. The afternoon had deepened by the time Hercule Poirot, when Inspector Arthur stepped outside the Worthington Recents. A crisp breeze stirred the autumn leaves that danced across the quiet street. Poirot adjusted his hat and tucked his gloves into his pocket. With his usual fidiousness, he walked slowly along the pavement, deep in thought, until Inspector Arthur finally spoke. Pooh, he said, glancing sideways at the little Belgian among the 3 of them, Florence, Harper, and Lily. Who do you suspect? Whom do you think committed the murder? Poirot's expression was unreadably. His small hands were folded neatly across his chest, and his gray-green eyes seemed distant, lost in thought. At this stage, mourn me, he said thoughtfully. It is not possible to say anything with certainty. All 3 are under suspicion. Circumstances, they are curious, but very soon the truth will reveal itself. Arthur looked unconvinced. Still seems strange to me that a woman like Florence would commit such a brutal act. Poirot merely smiled, that secretive knowing smile that Hastings, had he been present, would have recognized at once. Appearances, Inspector Pooh said gently, are most deceptive. Must verify every word that has been spoken. It is not now to accept what we are told. One must test it. Arthur nodded. Where do we start? Our first step, Poirot said crisply, is to verify Madame Florence's alibi. She claimed she was at a party at her friend Dorothy's house. Let us see whether that is indeed the truth or a convenient story. Without wasting further time, they summoned a cab and set off towards the neighboring village where Dorothy resided. The journey was a short one, through winding country lanes bordered by hedgerows and gently rolling fields. The village was smaller than Brentford Street. A cozy cluster of cottages around a central ran Dorothy's house, newly built and standing slightly apart from the older cottages. It was easy to find Poirot, and Arthur ascended the short gravel path and rang the bell. A few moments later, the door was opened by a cheerful-looking young woman with chestnut hair and quick, intelligent eyes. Good afternoon, Arthur said, showing his badge. I am Inspector Arthur, and this is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. We are here regarding your friend Florence Worthington Dreyfus. A smile faltered, and she stepped aside at once. Of course, officers, please come in. They were ushered into a comfortable sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth, throwing a warm glow across the room. Poirot, after accepting a seat with his usual elaborate politeness, wasted no time. Mademoiselle, he said, we regret to inform you that Redward Worthington has died under suspicious circumstances. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth. Good heavens, I had no idea. Poor Florence, how terrible for her. Poirot inclined his head gravely indeed. and we are making certain inquiries, madame. Florence Hay stated that she was here at your house, attending a party, at the time of her husband's death. May I ask, was there in fact such a party? Yesterday evening, Dorothy. Nodded immediately. Yes, there was a small gathering. Nothing formal. I bought this house only last month, and I wanted to celebrate with a few close friends. Florence arrived just after 7. I think Poirot's eyes gleamed, and she stayed throughout. Dorothy hesitated slightly. Well, almost. She did leave for a little. While Arthur leaned forward, she left. Yes, Dorothy confirmed. She realized she'd forgotten her purse. She said she needed it, and that she'd just popped back home to fetch it. She was gone perhaps 25 minutes. No longer. Then she returned and joined the party as if nothing were amiss. Poirot was silent for a moment, digesting this new piece of information. And during that time, mademoiselle, he asked gently, did you notice anything good about her? Anything unusual in her behavior? Dorothy shook her head. No, nothing. She was a little flustered when she came back, but I thought nothing of it. After all, it was just a purse. Pooh, smiling politely. Anne rose to his feet. You have been most helpful, mademoiselle. Thank you. Dorothy saw them to the door, still looking concerned. They were back outside. Arthur immediately turned to Poirot as they walked back towards the waiting cab. Well, what do you make of that? He asked. It fits, doesn't it? She could have easily slipped away, gone home, killed her husband, and returned to the party without anyone being any the wiser. Pooh made a small humming sound deep in his throat. It is possible, yes, he admitted. Thee told me would allow it. Arthur looked at him keenly. Then, you think she did it? Pooh held up one hand. No, mon ami. You rush to conclusions. We must remember, it is easy to suspect the obvious, but the truth, it is sometimes less convenient. Arthur grunted. Still, it puts Florence in a very awkward position. Poirot agreed. Silently rode back towards Brentford Street in thoughtful silence, each man lost in his own speculations. Countryside sped past the windows, a blur of gray fields and leafless trees. Poirot's mind, however, was razor sharp and focused. Florence's alibi had a gap, a dangerous gap, and yet instinct told him that the matter was more complex than Ita appeared at length. Poirot spoke almost to himself. Why leave the purse behind at Isa? Curious thing, is it not? Arthur frowned. You think it? Was deliberate. Poirot gave his little shrug. I think that we must look closely at for reaction in cases of murder. Even the smallest detail may be a calculated move. As they neared their destination, Poirot sat forward briskly. There is more work to do, Inspector, he said. We must continue to examine not only what is said, but what is not said. The cab pulled up outside Edward Worthington's house once more, and Poirot stepped down, his mind already plotting the next steps of his careful investigation. The game was afoot, and Hercule Poirot intended to win it. Chapter 7. A fine discovery. The afternoon was wearing on as Hercule Poirot and Inspector Arthur made their way towards Lily's modest cottage. The air was brisk, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Poirot walked at a steady pace, his gloved hands neatly clasped behind his back, his mind busy with 1,000 small observations. They turned the corner into a quieter lane. Poirot broke the silence. We should investigate Lily's home, he said thoughtfully. Perhaps we might find something of interest, the surroundings in which a person lives. They can tell us, mon ami, sometimes more than the person himself. Arthur nodded in agreement. He had come to respect Poirot's meticulous attention to detail, even when it seemed to lead down the most unlikely paths. Poirot slowed his steps slightly and cast a glance at Arthur's neat police uniform. You, Inspector, he said, kindly shoulder mean. Outside, a man in uniform, he brings caution, suspicion, whereas he smiled modestly. But a friend come to call. Arthur gave a short laugh. Very well. Poirot waited by the gate as they approached the modest front door. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his coat, and then rapped smartly on the wood. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal a young girl, no older than 13 or 14. She had dark hair pulled back into a simple place, and she regarded Poirot with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. Poirot offered her his warmest, storming smile. Bonjour, I am a friend of your mother's. Might I have a word with her? The girl shook her head politely. Mama's not home, sir. She's gone to work. Q made a sympathetic sound. Ah, of course. Then perhaps, while I wait, could I trouble you for a glass of water? The day has been long, and one grows thirsty. Nesta Baderga, eager to be helpful, nodded and invited him inside. Poirot stepped into Asma but tidy parlor, modestly furnished with well-worn chairs, a faded rug, and Asma's side table stacked with old magazines. Everything was clean though, a little threadbare, the signs of modest means. Honestly maintained, the girl motioned for him to sit while she disappeared towards what Poirot presumed was the kitchen. Left alone, Poirot allowed his keen eyes to roam unobtrusively around the room's gaze settled almost immediately on a photograph hanging on the wall above the fireplace. It depicted two people, a man and a woman, standing side by side, smiling stiffly at the camera. The man wore a fisherman's jacket and the woman a sturdy bonnet. They stood before a backdrop of what appeared to be a seaside village. Poirot rose and moved closer, studying the picture carefully. There was something old-fashioned about the frame and the pose, suggesting a photograph had been taken some years ago. Just then, the girl returned with a glass of water. Poole accepted it graciously. Mademoiselle, he said, then, with a casual nod towards the photograph, he asked, and who is the lady in the picture? The girl beamed. That's my Nana, my grandmother. She lived by the sea before she passed away. Poirot smiled and murmured his condolences. Taking a polite sip of the water, he seated himself again, briefly pretending to relax. Even as he did so, his sharp eyes caught a glint of something unusual at the edge of the carpet near a low sideboard. When the girl returned to the kitchen, Poirot rose once more, moving with feline lightness, bending down carefully, picked up a thin strand that had caught on the rug's frayed edge. It was fishing wire, almost invisible to the naked eye, extraordinarily fine and strong. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A curious find in a maid's parlor far from the sea. He folded the strand carefully into a clean handkerchief and tucked it into his pocket. His mind was already racing ahead, connecting Atti's possibilities, methods. When the girl reappeared, Poirot offered her a final smile. Mademoiselle, you have been most kind. I shall not trouble you further. He made his way back to the door, stepping out into the crisp afternoon, where Inspector Arthur leaned casually against the gatepost. Arthur straightened at once. Anything? Heast quietly. Poirot gave a small, enigmatic smile. But of course, Monomile weighs something. Without offering more, Poirot set off briskly back towards the road, Arthur hurrying to keep pace as they made their way back towards the Worthington house. Arthur pressed him further. What did you find? Poirot's fingers tapped lightly against his coat pocket. A small thing, he said softly. A thing so small, so delicate, that it is easily overlooked, yet sometimes it is this malice of clues that opens the largest of doors. Arthur frowned. Fishing wire, Jess. So Poirot agreed. Fine. Strong, almost invisible in the wrong hands. A dangerous weapon, indeed. Arthur gave a low whistle. You think it's connected to the murder? Pugh's face was serious. Now, the lightness gone from his manner. I think, Inspector, that we are dealing with a crime of great ingenuity. A crime where every appearance has been carefully constructed to deceive. Paused, glancing up at the gray clouds gathering overhead. And very soon, Poirot said quietly, we shall reveal the truth, the whole ugly truth. They pressed on the village behind them, and the final stages of their investigation looming ahead. Chapter 8. The method of murder, the heavy atmosphere within the Worthington household seemed almost to buckle under the weight of the gathering storm. The family and servants alike were called into the grand drawing room. Their faces tight with worry, fear, and uncertainty. Tiro stood at the center of the room, poised and immaculate as ever, while Inspector Arthur lingered nearby, arms folded, watching the proceedings with a grim expression. The curtains were drawn, a dull gray light seeped through the edges of the windows, casting a muted gloom over the assembled company. Poirot cleared his throat gently, drawing every eye to him at once. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, firm, and carried the precise authority of a man who knew he was about to end the mystery once and for all. Madame Amuser, he began, I have gathered you all here because the truth must now come to light. I know who killed Mr. Edward Worthington and how the crime was committed. A ripple of movement passed through the group. Florence Worthington clutched the back of a chair. Harper shifted uncomfortably. Lily stood, stiff pale as chalk. Poirot's voice remained steady. First, he said, allow me to explain how murder was executed. He held up one finger. In this crime, 3 objects played critical roles. The first, the revolver, Mr. Edward's own Loflalilas. The second, the key found in his trouser pocket. The third, a thin, strong fishing wire such as one would use with a fishing rod. The room had grown utterly still. Only the fire cracked softly in the grate. Who continued each word, deliberate, building the chain of reasoning, link by link. The murderer, he said, first shot Edward directly in the heart, a precise, fatal shot which caused him to collapse immediately and die where he fell. He paused briefly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the gathering. After ensuring death, the murderer wiped the revolver, cleaned off fingerprints, and placed it back into Edward's hand, thus creating the initial impression of suicide. As several heads nodded instinctively, though none dared to interrupt. But Poirot said, raising his voice slightly, there was more, much more. He stepped forward, indicating the floor. The body was then dragged across the carpet, not far, but enough I observed traces bloodstains leading from the spot of death to the fetal position, along with faint marks of dragging. A murmur of astonishment ran through their room. Florence's face had gone white as chalk. Harper stared at Poirot in disbelief. Poirot pressed on relentless. The purpose of dragging the body, he said, was top position. Mr. Edward so that the door and the pocket of his trousers aligned perfectly. This was critical for what came next. Poirot now the actions carefully with Hitchens. The murderer tied one end of the fishing wire to the spare key. The other end, off the wire, was threaded inside Mr. Edward's trouser pocket through a small hole made near the seam at the bottom. He glanced meaningfully around the room. Then the murderer exited the room, closed the door, and locked it from the outside using the asper key. Gasps rose, but Poirot held up his hand for silence. After locking the door, he said, the murderer gently tugged on the fishing wire, drawing the key underneath the gate-pit, the bottom of the door, and guiding it until it settled neatly inside Edward's pocket. Poirot's voice dropped slightly. At the final moment, the murderer gave a sharp tug, snapping through her so that the key remained securely within Edward's pocket, while the murderer stood safely outside it. Explanation sent a shudder through the listeners, even Inspector Arthur looked momentarily stunned. A beat absence passed. Then Arthur asked, frowning deeply, but Mr. Poirot, how can you be so sure? Poirot turned to him, his small frame brimming with quiet certainty, because Poirot said softly, the murderers, none other than Lily. An audible gasp swept through the room. All eyes swung towards the maid, who stood frozen, her hands clenched tightly together. Poirot continued, merciless yet calm. When I visited Lily's home, I discovered a leftover piece of the same fine fishing wire, hidden but overlooked. That alone would be suspicious. Yes, but there's more. Lily, trembling, now spoke up desperately. Finding wire doesn't prove anything. Why would I kill Mr. Edward? Poirot's eyes gleamed patience. Moiselle, the key found in Edward's pocket. Poirot gestured to Inspector Arthur, who brought it forward still. Here's a tiny fragment of the broken wire. It matches exactly the wire found at your house. Arthur held the key up for all to see, though almost invisible to the naked eye. A sliver oft. Fine wire clung stubbornly to the metal. A stunned, almost disbelief insolence filled the room. Poole pressed on, and as for your question, why would you do such a thing? The answer lies in a photograph hanging in your sitting room. He turned slightly, as if addressing the entire house. In that photograph, there are two people, a man and a woman. When inquired, your daughter informed me that the woman is her grandmother and the man, Kira's voice sharpened as Mr. Edward Lilly gave a strangled gasp. Tears welled in her eyes, swayed as though she might faint. Then, in a choked whisper, she spoke. Yes, Ace, it's true, I killed him. The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Lily staggered forward, her hands shaking violently. It was my father. She sobbed when Mimother told him she was expecting a child. He left her. He abandoned her because she wasn't carrying a son. Him Reed. Another woman left my mother in disgrace, ruined her voice, broke. Tears ran freely down her face. She never married again. She spent her life in shame and sorrow, crying for the man who had destroyed her life. I grew up seeing her pain every single day. I swore that one day I would make him pay. Lily collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands, overcome by the sheer weight of her confession. Inspector Arthur moved forward slowly and gestured for the constable to step forward. François, when he spoke, was very quiet, almost sorrowful. It is a terrible thing, he said, when hatred and revenge take root in the heart of a child. Terrible and tragic. Constable gently helped Lily to her feet. She did not resist, seemed at last utterly spent, hollowed out by her own grief and raggias. They led her away. Poirot remained standing in the center of the room. Silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Florence wept quietly into a handkerchief. Her purr stared at the floor, expressionless. Inspector Arthur approached Poirot, his voice low. Another case solved. Moo. Poirot smiled faintly, though there was no triumph in it. He said, another case, another tragedy. He picked up his hat from the side table, smoothing it carefully with his gloved hand as he and Arthur made their way towards the door. Poirot paused, glancing once over his shoulder at the grand old house where pride, shame, and vengeance had collided so fatally. He spoke almost to himself. The human heart, Inspector, harbors many secrets, and some, alas, destroy both the keeper and the kept. And with that, the lower pro stepped out into the fading light, his small figure walking steadily into the twilight. Another secret had been uncovered, another burden laid bare, and somewhere, perhaps, the soul of a forgotten woman might finally rest in peace. Eplegethy, Worthington House, once a symbol of quiet prosperity, now stood subdued beneath a sky heavy with autumn clouds. Its grand stone walls, which had witnessed both triumph and tragedy, seemed to sag beneath an invisible weight. Inside, the staff moved in muted tones, restoring order to rooms that still whispered of past unrest. Drawing room had been cleared, the bloodstains scrubbed clean, the broken lives left to heal. In private, at the far end of the lane, Hercule Poirot stood quietly beside Inspector Arthur, gazing back at the house. He tapped his cane lightly against his shoe, deep in thought. It is always the same, mon ami, he said at last, his voice low. There is murder and there is motive, but underneath there is always the oldest story. Pride, resentment, braille. Arthur said nothing. He had come to understand that. Poor spoke not out at vanity, but out of a deep weariness with the darkness. He had, once again, uncovered. Poole adjusted his cuffs, his movements as neat and precise as ever. take no pleasure in such victories, he murmured. To solve a crime is one thing, but to mend the broken hearts, it leaves behind awe that even Poirot cannot achieve. Inspector gave a small, respectful nod. They stood a while longer, in companionable silence. The wind tugging gently at the hedges, lining the road. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, its chimes thin and mournful against the brooding sky. At last, Poirot turned away, his small figure walking steadily into the misty afternoon. He carried with him, as always, the burden of knowledge, the cost of having seen too much of human frailty behind him. The house receded into shadow, its secrets spent, its silence profounded. Thus, Hercule Poirot moved onward. One more mystery lay to rest.